Okay, so we're talking about the parable of the mustard seed. So again, it's that green that kind of becomes this big shrub, 9 to 12 feet, right? Um, so we talked about like not dismissing things because they initially seem to be insignificant. So I talked about that example for priestly ordination. But the next point I want to make with regards to the mustard seed is this idea of patient endurance. So rather than trying to go for like the knockout punch, to kind of realize that there's something to be said about doing the right thing over a long period of time. And I think it's one of those principles which perhaps is so subtle that it seems hard to apply, but it's important to kind of grasp this, right? So it's not so much to like have patient endurance to the exclusion of creativity. So if you're doing the wrong thing over a long period of time, like that's not good too, right? So it's a matter of kind of like praying into it. So the example that kind of comes to mind, like, I think about oftentimes in seminary, things would be kind of rough, and so I remember one time talking to my spiritual director and saying like all these things that I didn't like about being in the seminary. I would just name all these different things, and they were all made up, but basically in that effect, I was having a rough time, And my kind of like subtle argument was like, okay, because I'm not having a good time and because like I find this uncomfortable, the Lord doesn't want me to be uncomfortable, so therefore clearly He's calling me to leave, right? And he caught me on that, right? And so it's one of these things, when you hear it out loud, it sounds like pretty obvious, but to remember this in life, right? So just because you're in a situation where like this feels uncomfortable, that's not reason enough to like leave or make a significant change. It's got to be situated in terms of God's call. And so the way he framed it to me, like, it was like, okay, is God calling you to go from this to that? Like a specific situation to an alternative specific situation. In the alternative, if you don't feel that call from a specific this to that, by default, you're called to kind of stay there, even though it's difficult, even though it sounds kind of painful. The Lenten Mission that we're going to do at St. James from March 20th to the 22nd, it's going to be about the Beatitudes. And I haven't started working on that yet because it's not March 19th. So, but basically the Beatitudes, like it's phrased a certain way. And blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the pure of heart, whatever. So clearly that the key word there is blessed, And sometimes what you hear is that, okay, a way to translate it is happy, which is a terrible translation, right? Happy are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Like, are you really happy? I don't know, right? So happiness implies sort of a certain, emotional euphoria. Or at the very least, the sense that subjectively, like, okay, I recognize this is pretty cool, and so that's why I'm happy, right? The more appropriate translation is actually blessed, so the church nailed it, right? So blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, right? So the way to think of it, it's the analogy that I like to use for myself. Imagine you're on a plane. So you bought the ticket, you're on the plane, and you're flying to this amazing destination, wherever it is. Say it's Hawaii or something, right? And you're on the plane, but you're going through some turbulence, and it sucks, right? But you are blessed. So here's a situation where, like, okay, subjectively, I'm not liking it. And I'm happy, not particularly. And I wouldn't even recognize that I'm blessed, but you were blessed all the same. So really important to kind of keep in mind. And then just to think it through, it gives you a certain freedom. So I'm not kind of like pulled this way and that by my love of comfort. It's one of these things. I mean, even going back to the whole, the parable of the sower, right? The idea of superficiality with regards to our faith. No one likes to think they're a hedonist, but a lot of times we are, right? But what's hedonism? Like, hedonism is like the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That's what hedonism is in a nutshell. And you like to think, again, that you're not a hedonist, but if you think about it, like, how do we tend to evaluate a good day? A good day is when things went according to plan. I set good goals because I don't have malicious intent. I'm a good person, right? I'm trying to feed my family. I'm trying to, survive in this big bad world. And so I look back on my day, and insofar as my little goals and expectations were fulfilled, it was a good day. Insofar as I had a maximum amount of pleasure and no amount of pain, awesome day, right? But to kind of like reevaluate things. So maybe in light of everything we're talking about here, maybe you look back on a day
and your day didn't go according to plan. And maybe your day was painful. And maybe your day involved a lot of inconvenience. And people yell at you and they were mean and cruel and all those things. And you look back and it's like, okay, was that a happy day? Well, maybe not. But maybe you look back and it's like, yeah, at the same time, it was a blessed day. It changes your whole style of thinking. And again, gives a certain kind of freedom. And that's why it's really important to do this type of prayer called the examine prayer, right? So where has God been throughout the course of my day, right? How has he been calling into my life? Did I recognize it? Or did I simply see without seeing, hear without hearing? Did I correspond to those invitations? And based on that, what might I do going forward? There's one really good example of this priest named Father Andrew Mattingly, I think his name is. A really easy version of the examine prayer. It's called the 3-2-1. So easy to remember. Okay. So the 3-2-1. So the whole idea is that you look back in your day. What are 3 things that I'm thankful for? What are 3 things that I'm thankful for? And secondly, what are 2 things that I could have done differently? Like 2 things I'm asking the Lord for forgiveness for. And then the last thing is, what's 1 thing I could do in terms of a resolution going forward? So 3 things I'm thankful for, 2 things I'm asking for forgiveness for, and then 1 resolution going forward. Now, rather than look at that as an abstract prayer exercise that I tack on to my already extending list of prayer cards or whatever, to situate it in terms of desire. Like, the way to look at religion at its best is all about becoming fully alive, right? So joy, happiness, peace, freedom, the whole 9 yards, right? So if you look at the 3-2-1 in terms of the invitation to participate more fully in God's blessed life, all of a sudden it takes a lot more color, right? So 3 things that I'm thankful for. Where has the Lord blessed me throughout the course of my day? And what you'll realize a lot of times, it's not necessarily in the correspondence or the fulfillment of your pre-existing plans. There's something really beautiful about unexpected graces where here's something that I didn't anticipate. Here's something I didn't generate for myself. Here's something that even came in weird packaging, But at the same time, a blessing nonetheless. And again, did I recognize that? Did I recognize this unexpected thing, which was a blessing despite my subjective experience of it in the moments? Second thing about forgiveness, right? So again, the invitation to new life. To get out of the mentality of oh, I'm a good person, therefore I don't need conversion. The Lord constantly is offering to us new life. And so how did I not correspond to that particular invitation? To go back to the Mother Teresa movie, there's this little bit where even before she founded the Missions of Charity, she made a vow, and that her vow was I will never refuse God anything, And just to kind of think about that, right? So in terms of the moral life, the commandments, for example, is pretty clear stuff. Do this, don't do that, and so on and so forth, right? But she was saying, okay, beyond that, beyond my sheer duty and obligation before the commandments and moral life, what does the Lord call me to do in terms of particular inspirations? And basically what I want to do is that I want to correspond to all those invitations, to give out everything and refuse of nothing. And what comes through in that movie is that apparently even deep into her ministry with the Missions of Charity, the Lord was still asking her, and this comes through her letters, will you refuse me this? Will you refuse me that? And, there's a part of you that might kind of hear that, think, oh, come on, leave the poor girl alone. It's Mother Teresa, right? But it's one of these things, clearly there's still more to give. There's still more to give. There's still opportunities to say yes, right? And when you look at Mother Teresa's life, right? This is the thing that's really captivating about her, right? It shows what is possible when you habitually always say yes to God. Nothing done in Albania, begins by making sure that people can die with dignity, with a roof over their head and, being told that they're loved, right? And all of a sudden, Nobel Peace Prize and all of Missions of Charity changes the world, living saints, And it's just one person. And I was I don't know about you, but that's it's an exciting thing, but it also haunts my dreams. I remember a long time ago, I gave a share life talk when I was a seminarian, and I went out inside. I was talking to someone, and he was like, "Hey, I think I was called to the priesthood once." I'm like, "Oh, really? What happened?" It was an older guy, right? And he goes, "I got married to her." He pointed to this gorgeous blonde. But inwardly, I was like, "Fine. I sure hope you discern that properly." I really hope that you took it to prayer and was like, okay, Lord, like, are you calling me to this vocation as opposed to that vocation? And if you're calling me to vocation of marriage, are you calling me to marry this girl as opposed to that girl? Because if you didn't do that with honesty and sincerity, like, the possibilities that were just passed up because, I don't know, you lack generosity, you lack bravery. Like, I don't know about you, that would always constantly haunt my dreams, you know? And that's why it's always a bad thing or a bad question to kind of say, like, well, if I do this and that, like, okay, well, if I don't pursue this vocation from the Lord or the call to greatness, you know, will the Lord still love me and stuff? And it's like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say shut up, but like, part of me kind of does, right? Just again, look at Mother Teresa. Here's one person, like, I say yes to him like all the time. Doesn't that make you curious? Like, what if I said yes to God in all things? That's why it's really problematic to live on the surface, you know? To live on the surface of what people can kind of like see and comprehend, because it's relatively easy to kind of like put on a certain good public face, especially when you have limited contact with people, and you can fool people into thinking all sorts of things about you and your character and stuff. But like, you know, more importantly, God knows, you know? And again, it's not in the sense of like, oh, God's disappointed in me, but like, you know what's possible, even in theory, when you go all the way, if you give God everything and hold back nothing. So there's that. Now, going back to the whole mustard seed thing, right? So don't dismiss things because they seem insignificant, patient endurance. But in the meantime, what do you do, right? In the meantime, what do you do? Don't be distracted by seemingly larger seeds, right? So again, here's like the mustard seed, the grain of a mustard seed blossoms into like, 9 or 12 feet, right? Don't be distracted by things which seem to have kind of larger immediate results. So the example that comes to mind, Stephen Covey, with the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of the things he talks about in that book is like the distinction between the character ethic versus the personality ethic. The character ethic versus the personality ethic, right? And so the character ethic was something which was emphasized in self-help literature for years. I think extending to like the 1950s or something. And the character ethic is, I become a good person. I become a person of good character. I become the good tree, which inevitably produces good fruit. So I don't focus on the fruit. I focus on being a good tree, because a good tree can't help but produce good fruits, right? So that's the mentality and philosophy behind character ethic. Because later on, though, things have shifted, So now we're focused on not so much the character ethic, but again, the personality ethic. And the personality ethic is, I want people to think that I'm a good tree, right? And again, the thing I want to press upon you, friends, is that it's really easy to convince people that you're a good tree. But again, it's a missed opportunity. So when you think about like succumbing to temptation for like, the larger seed of the immediate results, that's an easy thing, right? And so especially in moments where you're in the breach, and you're living in that space of like doing the right things, even though they're hidden over a long period of time, suffering endurance, there can be a temptation to be like, well, I'm sick of that. I want to break out of that stance and do something where I feel affirmed by the world, where it's immediate, flashy sort of way. So I'll post on social media or like something, right? But it's just enough to take you out of that space. It's one of these things, you got to be careful about this, right? Like I remember talking to a friend of mine, this fellow seminarian. We're having dinner, right? And he was like saying, Eric, it's like this. What's your heart like? Your heart is like, he's searching for the word or a symbol. And he's like, it's like this. It's like a thimble, right? And your heart can so easily be filled with stuff, such that you had nothing left for God. And you got to be really, really careful about that. It's always a deadly thing when you think you have like time and energy to burn. You actually don't. You actually only have time to do the few things the Lord wants you to carefully well, and that's it. That is it, And just think about how easy is it for us to lose our sense of concentration or recollection. It's like, how easy is it for us to get tired? So you only have a limited amount of time and energy. And so like, what is it the Lord wants me to do? Do I recognize that? And do I do those things carefully and well? Okay. Another thing you want to do in terms of like, pursuing this particular point of view, you want to kind of concentrate your energies in one direction. So it's a variation of like focusing on a few things the Lord wants you to do carefully and well, right? So it's funny, like they say that to be a good confessor, you got to be a good penitent. So I remember once going to confession and talking to this priest, and he said it, it's funny, he said it almost in passing. It wasn't like the main lesson he wanted to give to me, but it's funny how people can say things in passing, but all of a sudden that sticks with you, you know? So one of the things he said was like, anything that you don't do for Christ, it's a total waste of your time. And then why are you doing it? And so it just stuck with me. It's like, he's absolutely right. And it's not like I didn't know it before, but just, you've been in situations like that, you hear something that you kind of knew before, but just the time and place you're at in terms of your spiritual journey and just the way it's put in that moment, it just pierces you to your heart. And that was a situation for me. Like, yeah, like anything I don't do for the Lord in terms of an act of love, it's a total waste of my time. Not even a slight waste of my time, it's a total waste of my time. I think about, there's this book called This is the Day the Lord Has Made by Wilfred Stinnison. And it's a selection of his homilies. And the covers, it's got flowers and stuff. It's almost like chicken soup for the soul, and but really profound stuff in terms of that book. And early on, because it's categorized by like month and date, he talks about, I think he talks about haste, right? And he's talking about how it's really important to kind of settle into this rhythm that the Lord wants you to observe in terms of your life. And occasionally you'd be pulled out of that. Sometimes there are crisis moments where like, okay, this is urgent and important, right? But you want to quickly get back into that particular rhythm. And then he goes on to say that, it's funny, like we're really good at fishing all night and catching nothing. We're really good at that. We're really good at like squandering our limited time and energy on like nothing of value, nothing of substance. We're like amazing at that, right? But the sweet spot is like, okay, fish on this side of the boat at this particular time, as a result of which you catch an abundance of fish, right? And therein lies the discipline. Therein lies the discipline. I can't tell you how often, when I'm in pastoral practice, a situation will come up, whether it's like a specific situation dealing with administration, or like, something to do with like overt manifestations of evangelization. And here's this thing, and it's just like, the solution is not apparent to me. Like, so if it's a matter of like me kind of like, just applying that my will and like concentrate more, but it's not like that, right? So all I'm will do is like, okay, here's a situation. Honestly, I have no idea what to do. Oh, well, I'll just continue to live my life and the Lord will bring things to my attention. And he does, right? But you got to realize, okay, the sweet spot is that. As opposed to like, I'll just do something busy and frantic so I can give myself the consolation that I'm doing something. And we've all been there before. It's a variation of like the psychological mind. So like I feel better because at least I'm busy, at least I'm worried, right? And it's like, no, don't save your energy. Right? You want to fish at the appropriate time at the Lord's command. Another thing that's really important too is like to realize that your journey is unique and specific to you. This is no small thing, right? So, we hear all the time, like, don't compare yourself to other people, but it is acutely true when it comes to spiritual life. Your vocation before the Lord is unique and specific to you as an individual. And I want to make sure you hear that correctly, because we can receive that as an invitation to complacency, but it's not meant to be that, right? So the way I like to frame it to people is like, we look around, there's people that we admire, right? So, certain people in our lives, like maybe our mom or like, whoever, right? And the thing is like, okay, like I admire this person so much that I want to be this person. And it seems to me there's a certain safety in that, right? So I'll just like whatever that person does and I'll do what that person does, right? But you're actually called specifically to not do that and to trust in the work that God is doing in your heart. The whole idea of corresponding to God's particular vocation for you is to recognize that his call is unique and specific to you. So you're called to be the saint in which God calls you to be a saint. Really, really important to know. Yeah, I'll give you an example. This is not quite on point, but still somewhat relevant. So I remember in my first parish, I was talking to this young lady, and she came in and she was like so worried and scared and stuff. And her voice was trembling and whatever. And we're talking, and it's like, oh, what's up, right? It's like, oh, I just, I'm thinking about like this retreat I just came back from. I'm thinking about,
with God, my eternity and salvation and my vocation and expectations of people and my community and my parents and whatever. And I feel like I'm called to be a nun, but I'm just like so scared by the whole thing and whatever. And I was like, oh, wow, how old are you? And she's like 14 or something. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I would just focus on being a little girl, right? And she's like, really? And you see her shoulders just kind of fall. It's like, yeah, you know? And it sounds stupid, right? But like, that's it, right? There's a process to be kind of observed here. You know, it's a funny thing. To give you a similar example, I remember talking to a guy who was about to become a pastor in the diocese. And he was kind of asking for my advice, you know, because he knew I'd been pastor for a while. And I was like, oh, it's going to take a while to kind of find your own way in terms of like how God wants you to be a pastor, but don't worry, it'll come. But in the meantime, just relax and don't worry, don't be afraid of making mistakes, and just, or trust in the Holy Spirit working in you type thing. And it sounded like a lazy answer because like all the advice he was getting from other people was like, do this, do that, whatever. So like haste and immediacy, and also the subtle thing of like, do what I do, right? But it's like, no. Like the goal is not to help people become you. The goal is to help them become the persons that God's calling them to be. And just by virtue of the thing, like everyone is unique and specific and amazing in that uniqueness. See, that's the trust aspect, right? So when you look at somebody, for example, right, and like, okay, I'm trying to assist this person, whether it's like, you know, my friend or like my kid or like, you know, my parishioner, you know, to help them like grow or whatever. It's like the preliminary step is like, do I firmly believe in the seeds of greatness in this person's heart and the capacity of the Holy Spirit to bring it to fruition. And I have the humility to be like, I have no idea what that's going to look like in terms of like, you know, being instantia in terms of like this person's life. I have no idea, but I'm privileged to be part of this great adventure where like in this moment, some of the time we have, okay, what can I do to possibly help even a little bit, even though the Holy Spirit remains the great protagonist in this person's life, right? And that's the way to look at other people, but also that's the way to look at ourselves, right? That's why it's so problematic whenever we're so, you know, reductive, limiting with regards to ourselves. Like, oh, I get the whole thing, I'm a good person, or I'm this and that, whatever. But like, there's so much, like we don't realize how great you can actually become. Like, it's crazy, you know? Mother Teresa, I know I keep on coming back to her, right? But like, you get the sense talking to Mother Teresa that she's not like plotting or planning or strategizing, you know? It's not like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing and it's gonna move this person's heart in this way. She's just like, okay, I love Jesus and I just give myself entirely to him, or I just walk around and be around people and just say what I think. Like that's actually what she does. And people are like, this is incredible, right? Because that's actually how you're supposed to live. It's not supposed to be this weird self-conscious thing where I'm like planning and plotting. It's like, no, like I focus on being the person that God is calling to be, and the fruit will take care of itself, right? You know, going back to the whole thing with the example of my priest friend who became the pastor, you know, it's a weird thing I was thinking about in the aftermath of it. And the thing I wanted to say to him in retrospect, it's kind of one of those things like, oh, I should have said this, right? In order to become a good priest, for example, you got to be content to be like a bad priest initially. And again, don't take that the wrong way, right? But just this idea of like, okay, if I want to learn how to like become this like, you know, Olympic sprinter, I gotta learn first of all how to like jog, and then before that walk, before that like crawl, before kind of like, you know, all the different things, right? So you can't skip steps. In a weird sort of way, if I try to escape from just being me in this stage of the spiritual journey, you know, we're kind of like that little girl who was 14. Like, who knows? Maybe she will become a nun. I don't know, right? But what I did know was that at that moment, she's called to just focus on being a 14-year-old little girl, right? So same thing with us, right? The example that comes to mind to further illustrate that point, one of my favorite parables is the parable of the two sons. It's like really short and pithy. So people think it's like, you know, takeaway message is pretty obvious and rudimentary, but it's not, right? So, you know, this guy has two sons, you know, he calls them to work in the vineyard. One guy says yes, the other guy says no. And the guy who says yes doesn't count, and the guy who says no eventually comes back. Gospel of the Lord. That's the end of the story, you know? And so you think about it, it's like, what's that all about, right? And it's this thing, right? So basically, okay, the master is the Lord, obviously.
The vineyard is the world, and the work is the work of salvation. Now, how's the work of salvation brought about? Certainly in a broad sense, through the correspondence of my will to the will of the Father. But in a very particular sense, it's through the narrow way of the cross. And so that's the reason why the Father goes to the Son's one at a time personally. Because back in the day, it wouldn't be like that. Back in the day, it'd be like, I send a delegate because I'm rich and I'm powerful, and it's not a request, it's a command. Do this thing where you're out of the will, right? But instead, this guy goes to them each at a time personally, because what he's asking of them is super intimate. It's like part of my mission, part of my being, right? But also it requires total buy-in, right? Because what I'm asking is, will you share in this mission of suffering and dying for the salvation of the world, right? Now, the guy says yes initially. It's, if you look at the initial translation, it's a very quick and superficial yes. I always think of it like the Pirates of Penzance, saying, my captain. And it's like, did you hear what I said, son? Like, I don't think he quite took it in what I'm saying to you, right? And the reason why the second guy initially says no is because he gets it, right? Like, I understand what the Father has asked me to do, and yes, for a good cause. Again, it's for a good cause, but at the same time, the human part of me is not chomping at the bit to suffer and die for anything, right? And so I go away. But then, because I have a certain comfort level and trust in my relationship with the Father, I can be honest with him in terms of saying to him, I feel like saying no, and I do say no. But at the same time, when I examine my heart with time and distance, I realize in retrospect that despite my initial reticence to suffer and die for anything, my love of my Father is greater than that. And the Father knows that he knows that the Son has that within them, as we all do. See, that's the thing, as we all do, right? And so the Father gives him the time and space to realize that, and let that be a great consolation for each one of us. Right? So it's one of these things, like you hear about it, and like in terms of the allure of sin and like, suffering and death and all these different things, right? That's why there's nothing to be afraid of, right? You can go before your Father in heaven and say like, I don't like suffering, I don't like death, I'm afraid of this, that, and the other thing, and just be like raw and brutally honest. I'm like, yeah, I know. Just like I know in that story of the parable of the two sons, right? But son, if you examine your heart, you'll realize that you want something more, So deeper than my fear of suffering is my willingness and desire to correspond to the call of greatness and to be with my beloved in the stance of like being as well as mission. And again, that's true for each one of us, but it's a variation of what we talked about earlier, right? So it's like, spiritual maturity, it's like you have to make that realization on your own. It's not been like really a decision. It kind of is, but like in the sense of like, it's already true, but you got to discover it, right? I go through like, the honesty and like the brutal kind of like, well, Lord, what about this, that, and the other thing? That's fine. That's part of it, right? It's part of like growing up and, working towards becoming an Olympic sprinter, right? But when you go through that, like you'll never end up, for example, thinking like, and I just realized that my deep desire is to say no to Christ. You won't do that. Like you won't. Like, so that's why you don't have to be afraid of like hashing through the mess, right? But the thing is, if you have the wherewithal, the courage, and the stomach to hash through the mess, and it comes to the point where like, oh my gosh, I realize I do love the Lord Jesus Christ, then you're unshakable, right? It's no longer like because of immediate reward or because of the world's affirmation or whatever. But like I said, no, I've discovered through myself, through my own introspection and intimate prayer with Jesus Christ, that this is where my heart's at. And that's their point, right? Like there's no one can do that for you. You have to go through that inner journey yourself. And it's painful. It's painful. Perhaps because I've done it before. But there's no skipping that step. I'll give you an analogy by way of my own life, So like when I was on internship, my internship pastor, his room was across from my room. And our doors were both open, so I could see him, he could see me. And recurrently would do this thing where like, he'll look over and be like, hey, something's bothering you. Something's bothering you, we should talk. And I'm like, nothing's bothering me. I don't want to talk, right? And it wasn't even like I'm hiding things from him. It was like, I don't know, like I just, in retrospect, I was burying things because, sometimes you go through life and you're so used to people not listening and not caring and you're just trying to live for the weekend or whatever. that there's parts of your heart which kind of like die, and like you forget about your hopes and dreams and stuff, and do people even care? So like, how you doing? I'm fine, because I can't hope for any more. Anyways, so this was going on, and so he would say like, no, we should talk. Okay, fine. And so we'll sit there, across from each other, and he's like, yeah, so what's in your mind? Like, I don't know. Is something bothering you? I'll get to go one thing. That's all. And he'll press. And then finally, after digging, I'll be like, oh my gosh, well, there is something, right? Then I'll dig a little more, and it's like, oh, that's not just a little something, it's a huge something. And before you know it, I'll be like bawling. And I was bringing up all these things in terms of like, why I don't like myself, why I don't think I should be a priest, and all my fears, the apprehensions and whatever, right? And because they were like raw and real and stuff, and we're having this conversation, like, it is no time for falsehood. And so it's not just, just read chapter 25 of this book and things will be fine. It's like, if I'm bringing up this stuff and we're really talking about it, then I want to talk about it. I'm not going to walk away for some like empty platitude. Like, forget that. The time for falsehood is over. Right? And what would happen, we'd talk about these things. And at the end, it'd be like, after like all that effort and literally like tears and like stuff, at the end it'd be like, okay, I feel hopeful to like that's enough for tonight and until tomorrow. And we did that like all year. But the thing I want to suggest to you, friends, is that, again, that's a step that you can't skip, which is why it's problematic, okay? Like luckily I was able to have that particular relationship to work through different things, and obviously presume like trust and love and commitment and always, whatever, right? Which is why, for example, in terms of Christian community, this is something I'm trying to teach our own parish, like, in different ways. Like, that's what we need. It's a variation of like God's love being manifested incarnationally. God could give us grace in unmediated fashion, but typically what he does is that he gives us grace and gives his love through people, through the church, through Christian community. But we need to have the mutual stomach for that type of interaction where I take a chance and be vulnerable. And then if I'm the recipient, to not be like surprised or scandalized by that, but to have the willingness to journey with other people, because I've had the stomach to make that journey myself. And that's why, for example, like, I could be in situations where I'm talking to people, like in the office, for example, and they bring up all these things. And literally in my mind, I'm like, shoot, I have no idea. No, I have no idea like what to, how this is going to play out. But I do have confidence that things are going to work out, because I've been there before, right? It's the fruit of having not skipped that step in terms of facing the personal darkness and realizing how Christ's light shines through that, and nothing can separate from the love of Christ. So really important. Okay. Now, the parable of the leaven is kind of interesting. It kind of ties hand in hand with the mustard seed situation. So the idea of, again, something starting small and flourishing over time, right? So the thing with leaven, right, is that it's the leaven that's mixed into 3 measures of flour. And so a measure was basically 15 liters. So 3 times 15, right? And the key thing there is that the woman hides the leaven deep into the flour. So it's not just like I hide it deep within. So the primacy again of the hidden life. So, the church fathers are really big about this in terms of like, okay, this represents this and this represents that. So just to make it easy, right? So the woman represents what? The woman represents the church, right? And what's the flour? The flour is us. And what's the leaven? The leaven is Christ, right? So what's the principle of growth? The principle of growth is Christ within us. And the idea is that the church wants it to be planted deep. So deep roots, obviously, but also this idea of, over a long period of time, that principle of growth comes to fruition, right? I remember like years ago doing a funeral, and someone gave a eulogy, and in retrospect, I don't know, I guess she didn't really have a well-developed understanding of her faith. I don't think she was even passing her faith. And she made this comment where it was like, I think about my mother, and I think about the meaning of life. Meaning of life is what people remember about you when you die. And I thought, oh no, that's not true, And you need to think about that. That's pretty sad. I know people they're like, oh, it's so moving. It's like, is it? Is it moving? I think it's pretty depressing, actually. But even just think about it. I think it was Jose Maria Escrivá. He's like, you wait like how many generations? Like 1 generation, 2 generations maybe 3, and they forget, right? And that's all my life is. Like, I'm simply a memory in like the minds of my loved ones. That's the meaning of my life. That's crazy, right? Rather than this idea that, okay, every moment has meaning. Every moment has meaning in terms of the potential to do something great, which is locked for all eternity, which reverberates throughout time. I think about the parable of the 10 virgins, one of my favorite parables in the entire gospel, right? 10 virgins, 5 are foolish and 5 are wise. And they're all out to, meet the bridegroom. And they all have lamps, right? And the 5 foolish have a little bit of oil in their lamps. 5 wise have plenty of oil. And then they're waiting, and the oil is burning down. 5 foolish are like, oh my goodness, our oil is running out. Please, wise virgins, give us some of your oil. And the wise will say, no, get your own oil. And so then they leave. They go back to the marketplace. In the meantime, surprise, surprise, the bridegroom comes. And then they all go in, they shut the door. And then the foolish come back and please let us in. I never knew you. Goodbye. Gospel of the Lord. You're like, whoa, that's harsh, So it's one of these things, right? All the parables are provocative, and they're intentionally meant to be so. So if you're reading the parables honestly, there's meant to be this point where part of you said the parable and you're like, hey, that seems weird. That seems strange. Or that seems crazy. If you don't perceive that tension in the text, then you're not reading the thing honestly. But if you give up at that point, it's because you lack faith. So you gotta have both. You gotta have faith and commitment, but also like reading a thing honestly. That's why it's kind of interesting. Like, I don't know, like it's one of these things, right? I think when people read the gospel, I think out of a misguided sense of trying to be overly reverent, there's a sense that, okay, I don't give like honest response in terms of like what I actually think with regards to this particular text. But it's really important to kind of bring that to the table. Lord, this seems weird, or I'm afraid of suffering, I'm afraid of death, so I want to back away. But I bring it to the table because you want the real me as opposed to the fake me, even though it's couched in terms of the ideal me. Okay. Now we look at that parable, the parable of 10 talents. A lot of people confuse it in terms of like view it from the perspective of charity. So if you look at it from the perspective of charity, it seems crazy, right? It's like, please give us our oil. It's like, no. Except what? Are you supposed to be Christian, right? So there's this thing, like there's something about the oil which makes it that I can't give it to you even if I wanted to. There's something about the oil where even if I want to, I can't give it to you. And what is it? A simple way to look at it is that the oil represents my friendship with the Lord. The oil represents my friendship with the Lord. And the idea is that I can't give you my friendship with the Lord. It's the fruit of what you make of it. It's a pretty good way to remember the moral story of the gospel, that particular parable, but it's not entirely accurate, right? So you can take it one step further. Like it's accurate, but there's a little more richness to it, right? So another way to look at the oil is that the oil is the fruits of any decision I make in this life to choose Christ. So, okay, here's this moment, right? And like the primacy of love. What am I judged for at the end of my life? The sheep and the goats, right? Not how clever I am, not what stuff I have, but the quality of my love, right? Did I choose Christ? Did I choose love? And if I choose love, and this moment becomes this beautifully combustible material which can be consumed by the power of the Holy Spirit to sanctify my life and the world. That's the power of this moment if I choose appropriately, or I can pass it by, right? And the idea is that, okay, you look at that parable, this is the tragedy, right? The 5 foolish, they have some oil. They have some oil. So it's not that they're completely like, what the heck is love, right? They have some intuition of what it means to love. They just don't realize like how much oil is actually required for the journey. And it's not this abstract thing. It's not like, oh, I didn't know the Lord chose like this fixed amount versus that, right? It's like, what is the Lord demanding of us? The gift of ourselves. The gift of ourselves. So that's the idea. Like every moment is pregnant with meaning. And what matters is that I choose Christ, I choose love in this moment. And if I do that, again, the power contained in that moment explodes, sanctifies me, has potential to sanctify the world. And so I choose it like over and over again. And that's why I hate that whole thing of like, okay, what's Lenten about? Being remembered by your peers, right? Because you think about it, like in terms of like what people see of us,
or what they affirm and reflect backwards of that affirmation. It's very minimal, you know? When we think about every moment counting and having that capacity for meaning and power, most of the opportunities that we have to love Christ they're not seen by the world. They're not seen by other people. And that's why you can have a thing where, like, you know, here's this person, they seem ordinary. It seems like they weren't up to much, and they're not actually that impressive. We were a person of tremendous love, because in ways that you didn't fully appreciate, they always chose Christ. And so it goes with us, right? If we get distracted by like what the world finds to be important and valuable, we can forget about the primacy of like this moment above all other moments. Yeah, in terms of like the how, right? So in terms of the leaven, you know, so again, the woman puts the leaven inside the flour and it grows and whatnot. But we're not told exactly how it grows, which is kind of interesting, right? And so even though it sounds weird, it's like, it's a variation of like focus on what the Lord wants you to do carefully well. And a lot of times when it comes to how we grow and how we develop, it's not really a matter of like intellectual mastery or comprehension. And that's really, really important. It's funny how the mind works, right? It's a variation of like, I idolize my psychological annoyance, right? So I feel secure insofar as I feel like I have a complete understanding, intellectually speaking, of my situation and my future and my past. And it's like, good luck, right? Whereas actually that's not a requirement. So part of like my deep trust in the Lord, you know, it's this idea of like, okay, a lot of things are like, no idea, you know? Not just like in the world, but even within oneself, right? Like, you know, if you imagine yourself living your life, like, okay, I'm in this moment of confusion and pain, and how is that going to add up to my sanctification? I just know that the Lord isn't calling me to leave this thing because He's not calling me to go from this to that. So I'm called to be here in a state of pain and confusion. What's up with that? And again, the temptation is just to run from that because it's confusing and it's painful, right? But you gotta stay in the breach. Like I think about the calling of St. Peter, the really famous story, right? So, you know, St. Peter, obviously he's washing his nets. He's fishing all night. He's caught nothing. He's washing his nets. And so I begin the story tired and fatigued and feeling like a failure. And the Lord comes. And He wants to preach from my boats, you know? So He gets into Peter's boat, pushes away from the shore, gets better sight lines. You can see the crowd that's pressing in. I can see them, they can see me. And Peter, like, you know, he wants to tell Jesus to get lost, but he can't because the crowd's watching. They think Jesus is amazing, so I don't want to look like a jerk. So it's like, yeah, Rabbi, you can use my boat. I love it, you know? And so he gets in his boat. He gives a long sermon. The gospel doesn't say he gives a long sermon, but you know he gives a long sermon, right? It's funny, I'll raise a story with the kids in the schools, and we're like, you think kids, he gives a short sermon or a long sermon? And be like, long sermon. Why? Because he's Jesus. Doesn't even make sense. No, I think he gives a long sermon because it was a big crowd. It was a big crowd, right? And so imagine, like, you know, if you go to, like, a big crowd comes, it's like a solo concert, and then like the person sings like one song. It's like, like, have a good night. It's like, what? It's like riff off. So he gives a long sermon, right? And at the end of this long sermon, he goes, oh, let's go fishing. And Peter's like, he wants to tell him to get lost, but he doesn't because of the crowd. He's fishing and caught nothing. And yet he doesn't, right? Because again, of the crowd. But he catches this huge amount of fish. Now here's the thing, right? At the end of this story, okay, he catches this huge amount of fish. He realizes he's in the presence of divinity. And so, okay, depart from me, Lord, for I'm a sinful man. Don't be afraid, from now on you'll be fishers of men. And so he drops everything and follows Christ the Lord, right? Now, here's the thing. It's funny, I'll do this with the kids. Like, imagine it's the same story, except there's no Jesus and there's no crowd. So Peter's fishing, and he catches fish. And it's more fish he's ever caught in his entire life. What would Peter typically do with all that fish? And some kids are like, he would give it to the poor. And it's like, no. He would eat some and then sell the rest. And go home and say like, wow, that was an awesome day. And I'm rich, right? And so here's this thing. He walks away from more fish he's ever caught in his entire life. So I walk away from the thing which previously gave my life a sense of value and meaning. I walk away from that. And here's the thing. This is the point, right? How did that come about? How did it come about? It wasn't because he had a certain intellectual mastery of a situation. It wasn't like he read a book and was like, oh, now I know the value of detachment. And I realized Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, and life. It wasn't that. He began the story stressed out and tired and feeling like a failure. He ran to the Lord. And what did the Lord do? Oh, here, lie down. You've had a rough day. No. You're going to get your boat without permission. You're going to be annoyed. I know that too. And you're going to sit through my long sermon. And at the end, I'm going to ask you to fish, even though I know you fished all night and caught nothing. Okay? And so I'm more stressed out. I'm more like confused. I'm irritated or whatever. But somehow the Lord is using all that stuff to change my heart. And that's why it's important. You look at that particular gospel, right? It's not about what people think, So people look at that and like, oh, that's an historical narrative about one day Jesus Christ, he wanted to get followers, and he called Peter as the first disciple. Like, there is that, right? But it's a really important lesson for us to keep in mind going forward, right? Because the idea is that, okay, when I found myself in situations which are confusing and stressful and painful, and I have no idea what's going on, I turn to the Lord, he makes my life harder as opposed to easier, I gotta remember this gospel. I gotta remember this gospel. And if the Lord is not calling me to go from like this to that, to not rationalize my plight and say, well, the Lord is willing to suffer, so I'm just gonna leave just because it's painful. You gotta ground everything in God's call and then trust that, okay, even though I don't understand it, the Lord is using this circumstance to make me holy and to change the world. Now, in terms of like the treasure in the field, right? There's two things actually, the treasure in the field and pearl of great price. So I'll do these two things in tandem, right? So in terms of the treasure and the pearl, right? So they're both hidden. They're both hidden, right? So the idea here is that, okay, if something is hidden, it's meant to be found. Like it's hidden by someone, it's meant to be found by someone. And the idea is that we're not really told how these things are found, we're just told that they are found. So previously hidden, but then subsequently found. So what is required of the person to find the hidden treasure? They have to have a belief that there is a hidden treasure. They have to have persistence. And they have to have deep desires and act on those deep desires. I mentioned early on about how we don't like to think that we're hedonists, but in reality we actually are, right? And so often what happens is like we're living for the weekend. And this happens a lot, especially with young people. It's kind of sad. I'm going to have to address this in an intentional sort of way, but like a lot of times with young people, it's like I feel this existential angst. They wouldn't frame it in this way, but this is kind of what's happening, right? I feel this existential angst where like I don't find meaning in my life. I want to be happy, but I'm not happy. I don't know how to get there. And so I just distract myself with stuff. Social media, binge watching, whatever, right? And then I get to the weekend, I do something which distracts me even more in a really intensified sort of way, and then catch my breath, and then rinse and repeat, Whereas actually what you're supposed to do is live with deep desire. Like when I make this choice in this moment in time, right? When I look back on that choice, maybe I don't recognize it in the moment, but that's the reason why life is long, right? When I make this choice in the moment, when I look back now and I did the conscious examine, is that a choice which led me to be more fully alive? Did it correspond to the deep longings in my heart? Mindful of the fact that my deep desires also correspond with God's desires for me. And the idea is that, okay, I need to make all my choices in that regard. And that way, like life becomes exciting and meaningful. It's this beautiful collaboration between God and myself, especially knowing that God wants me to be fully alive and happy and all those things, right? Now, one example of that is like the Magi, I know we're fully out of Christmas, but indulge me, right? So the Magi, the three kings, right? Pope Benedict talks about this. He says, a lot of people, you don't even need his commentary, you know this. A lot of people would have seen the star of Bethlehem in the sky. A lot of people would have seen it because it was big and it was bright. And most people would have said like, hey, that's kind of bright. You don't see that every day. And then got back to eating their TV dinner, right? Like no change, right? But imagine they're like, there's something kind of interesting about that. And we feel a certain tug in our heartstrings that we should go follow that star. And again, the same thing with this parable with the treasure and the pearl. Like, I don't know where it's going to lead. I didn't know exactly what I'm looking for. But I know that where I'm at right now, this isn't quite it. So I'm going to follow that desire in my heart for something more, something to which I can give my life to, with the hope and conviction that that thing actually does exist. And so again, you go back to the parable of the treasure and the pearl. And the common denominator of both those is that they discover a thing and there's great joy, right? And there's great joy which precedes this act of selling and buying. And I want you to see something really kind of special about it, right? So the joy comes from this fact that like, okay, before I loved many things, I had a variety of interests, but now I find the one thing, the one true love. And in that I find integrity. In that I find peace. It's the whole thing with the rich young man, right? What must I do to inherit eternal life? And basically it's a question of joy. So just to break down that story, it's like, okay, I visit the temple, I pray, I call my mom, I'm trying to be a good guy. I follow the commandments since my youth. But I'm still not happy. What do I lack? And everyone remembers the whole thing about selling out and like, giving the money to the poor and following Christ. And people are like, oh, I need money. But to look at what that story represents, right? You can't fully possess the treasure which is Christ unless you sell out. So even go back to like the parable of the treasure, right? Like I could steal it, but somehow the guy intuits correctly that I need to rightfully possess the land in terms of deed and title ownership, and then properly receive this thing. And it's just a matter of spiritual physics, right? In order for my heart to be filled with Christ, I need to turn my back to everything which is not of the Lord. And it's a funny thing. It's not that, when I do this, like all of a sudden I'm like, it's just like Christ and like the ether, right? It's like once Christ is first in my life, then everything is in its proper place, I remember Father John Ricardo, he had a really good way to illustrate this. He goes, if I meet someone who puts Christ for real, first in all things, we could talk about anything. We could talk about football for hours, and it's like totally fine because there's a sense of rightness. And so even in a conversation about football, there's a sense of proper order. He goes, whereas if I talk to someone and Christ is not first in their life, when they talk about football for 5 minutes, it's colossally boring. I remember hearing that, thinking like, yeah, that makes sense. That totally makes sense. When you put Christ first in all things, it goes in its proper order. Everything becomes that more amazing and that more beautiful. One thing with regards to the pearl, right? So you notice that the guy who gets the pearl, right? So he's a merchant of fine pearls. He has a bunch of pearls. He discovers a pearl of infinite value. And he sells all his pearls to get the one pearl. And you might think to yourself, well, gosh, that doesn't make any sense. The more prudent business investment would be to like sell most of your pearls to get the one pearl, but keep some of your pearls just in case this one pearl thing doesn't work out. But if you read through the lines, the idea is that, okay, once I sell all my pearls to get this one pearl, I am done with the business of buying and selling pearls. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about that. I was ultimately leading or searching for something in which my heart could fully rest. And so I find the one pearl, and so now I'm no longer in the business of commerce. I'm in the business of contemplation. And so I spend the rest of my life enjoying being in the presence of this one pearl that is just way of life for it.